living history, museum stuff.
Hello.
We'll find out.
Well, thank you. Oh, so sweet. I couldn't say it perfectly. Oh, thank you.
So we would all like to take a seat. We're going to be getting started soon, and you'll have plenty of time to look at everything afterwards.
Good.
Thank you. So we'd like to welcome everyone to our first speaker series of 2025. And we are very, very fortunate that today we have Neal Hurst, who is the curator of Textiles and Historic Dress at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. He received his BA in History from the College of William and Mary, his MA from Wichita program in American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. He served as the assistant curator in the inaugural exhibition, for the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is where he's from. In August of 2016, Neal joined the curatorial team at Colonial Williamsburg, and he has recently opened a new exhibit entitled Elegance, Taste, and Style. And it is the Mary During Fashion Collection of 2024, and is co-curating the Centennial exhibition for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So we are very fortunate to have him here today. He has had an opportunity to look at some of the textiles prior to coming here. Well, when he did get here, just now, prior to, I sent him some pictures, but he's just so gifted and so professional in what he does that just in looking at some of the dresses that we have, I was just so intrigued that I was just sitting here talking to him and learning from his wisdom. And so now we all have that opportunity to learn what he has to say about these beautiful dresses that Tilly Bond had worn, Elizabeth Ormond Dickinson had worn, that have been preserved so exquisitely by the Cupola House. Speaking of the Cupola House, I'd like to introduce everyone, if they haven't met already. Vonna O'Neal, she's here. Would you like to say a few words?
Sure. Thank you all for coming for our first event this year. We have many more planned. Elizabeth Corker and Heidi Shoup Nastasi, I got that wrong. They are both in charge of our speaker series, and they have great programs set up for us for this year. I think all the way up until May, is that correct?
Yes.
So some of you joined us on Sunday, late Sunday afternoon to see the original woodwork of the Cupola House that's in storage right now. And yesterday we started part of the taking the replicated woodwork off of the walls in the back room, the least adorned room. It's already giving up secrets that we've been, and mysteries that we've had a lot of questions about. And I think Wade is here, and Andrew's not, but said as much as you get some questions answered, more are created all the time. And so I'm sure this evening, as Neal talks about the Cupola House collection of textiles here, I'm sure there will be many questions that you will ask, but there will probably be a lot more questions that come up and say, we don't know the answers to those, but we have great opportunities to do additional research. So welcome, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. Well, thank you all for having me and the first speaker of the series for this year. I did make the trip down from Williamsburg, 2 hours on the nose. but I've never been here before, so it's been a joy to kind of walk around town and explore a little bit while I was here. And came here, as Elizabeth was saying, and took a crash course on a few textiles, the gowns, the ladies that we have before you. And so I thought what I would do just for the next 45 minutes or so, talk a little bit about women's fashion through the lens of these gowns here. Talk a little bit about how women had clothing made in the 18th century, but then also talk a little bit about how these clothes had lives probably much longer than they were ever intended to be. Meaning that multiple generations ended up wearing these gowns, and we know by looking at them and taking a closer look at them. So to start with, does anybody know, well, let's start with this. What is the garment that a lady wears in the 18th century called? Do we know what it's called? What would, thoughts? Wait, you can't answer. You can call it dress, yeah. Now dress in the 18th century has a little bit different connotation compared to what we say today. Because most of us say we're gonna get dressed. But dress itself, that term, is a descriptor of the formality of dress. You have undress, which is the sort of plain everyday wear. You have full dress, the most fancy thing you can wear. You can have riding dress and walking dress. You can have any number of different sort of levels of dress, but that's not the actual garment. The garment in this case, so the sort of bronze colored piece here, the blue striped one here on both sides here, they're referred to as gowns. Now gown today also has a connotation because we generally think gowns are for what? Really formal, right? A wedding gown, a prom gown. But for the 18th century woman who is going to be working in her home, for the 18th century servant who is milking the cow, she could still have a gown on. But the quality of that gown is going to change. So we have two gowns here. We actually have three gowns. So one here in the box, a little hard to see. Come up, take a look at it in a few minutes. We just ask, of course, don't touch any of these. They're pretty fragile, but they're in good shape, but they're pretty fragile. I mean, all the gowns here are about 250 years old. So we have a gown here, and then this is another gown as well. Now, gowns throughout the 18th century are generally made up of either 2 or 3 parts. So the first part, it's a little easier to see it on this gown here, is the upper part, which is this literally whole thing in this box. This is a gown, but the gown is open robed, meaning that below the waist, there's nothing there. So you have to wear a petticoat. And the petticoat is a separate piece, and that gets tied around the lady's waist. So generally getting dressed, the lady first puts on her shift, linen, undermost garment that she's wearing, probably her stockings, and then her stays. The stays is the boned garment that is going to give the fashionable shape to the lady at that point in time. It's not a corset, it's not going to make her any smaller, but it is going to give a very conical shape to the body. Stays go on, and then the petticoat, as we mentioned, and then the gown goes on over top of that, over top of the arms itself. And then, depending on the era that we talk about, sometimes the gown closes down the center front, just simply with pins, either pinning directly into those stays, or like this gown, and I think it's missing on this one, which is very common. There is a triangular piece, and that one is called a stomacher. And the stomacher is how the gown would close. And so the stomacher gets pinned onto the stays, and then you see all that trim coming off the shoulders here? Those are called the robings. And the robings pin to either side of the stomacher to close the gown. Now for the majority of the 18th century, this is how gowns closed, with the stomacher and robings, about 80 years worth of time. That's what the ladies stuck with. But about the 1770s, so about the time of the Edenton Tea Party, about the time of the American Revolution, this begins to change. And they begin to favor new styles of gown that close down the center front. And so we find the ladies are changing the way they look. So the gown that you see in here is actually a center front closing gown. So it's a really nice look at how these things are changing in terms of fit. You go from the stomacher front, and this is actually a type of gown called a sack. Most English ladies would just call it that, a sack back. Because if you saw this on a mannequin, it would have loose flowing pleats coming off the back of the neck. Very, very, very elegant, very sort of typically formal sort of style for wear. This gown, which we won't lift up and take a look at because it's in really bad shape, is a fitted back or an English style of gown. And so those are kind of like your two main styles that we find being used all throughout the 18th century. Now, let me ask you this, who is making these things for the ladies, let's say here in Edenton, or back in Williamsburg, or in Philadelphia, or Boston? Who is the person making your gown? Do you know what they're called? Not seamstress. Seamstress just sews seams. So they're not skilled enough to actually do, by 18th century parlance, to do that kind of work yet. But the other trade, and this is a very old-fashioned term, but you do see it through the 19th century, of the Mantua Maker. M-A-N-T-U-A. Now, Mantua is actually a type of silk, and it's also sort of derived out of a name from a city in Italy. And so the Mantua makers are your gown makers. Now, what's the difference between a Mantua maker and the guy who makes the men's clothes? What are they called? Tailors, you're right. So you got the tailors, they are doing the men's wear, and then you have the Mantua makers, and they're making the women's garments. What defines the two trades? I will give you a hint. It's not that tailors are men, and Mantua makers are women, and that's typically common, that the sex divides the two of them, but it's something else. What is the difference between these trades? Want to guess? What's that? Give us a hint. Give you a lot of hints already.
Mantua makers have to do much more design work.
That's true. You're absolutely right. Yep. Mantua makers still have to do a little bit of design work.
The fabric?
Fabric, that can be true as well, yeah. Oftentimes very different types of fabric. But it actually has to do with how these garments are cut out. So the tailor's trade is ancient, dating back several hundreds of years. Hello. And their art is by measuring the body and making flat patterns. The flat pattern is drawn directly onto the fabric, and then it's cut out. So this is sort of ancient, as I said before. The Mantua makers, who are making all the pieces you see up here, this is a trade that has recently developed in the late 17th century. So kind of new to the clothing making world. But they don't use any measuring. They don't use any patterning. They drape the fabric directly on your body. And so that's why those ladies are wearing stays that put you in that ideal form. So they're taking the fabric that's been provided by the customer, they take a length of it, they place it directly onto the body, they pleat it, they pin it, they tuck it, they cut away the sections they don't need, they take it off the body, and then they sew it together. So it's a very different way of constructing clothing, and that's how all three of these gowns here were constructed some 250, 300 years ago. Now, the gowns that you see here, we have one that's we don't know much about, the one you see here. This is the earliest gown here on display. And then the other two, we actually have pretty solid Edenton provenance to them. So we'll talk about those in just a second. Anybody know what the material is on these two gowns, three gowns? Silk, you're exactly right, yeah. The folks here in Edenton, the ladies here who would have had these gowns made, they probably would have called it either sprigged or floral. Properly, it is brocaded silk. Interestingly enough, more than likely, even though Miss Lamond signed the Edenton Tea Party, probably imported from England. You won't tell her. But the fabric itself, the textile market itself, almost all the fabric that you would consume here in North Carolina and back up north where I'm coming from in Williamsburg is imported to us by way of England, by law. As a colony, we are dependent on English imports. And so obviously things get a little hairy in the 1760s. We're not too happy with England. And so we begin to kind of wrench down in terms of economic pressures with a series of non-importation agreements. And so it gets harder and harder to buy things like this. But after the war, guess who's back to being a captive market? Right here, North Carolina, Virginia, we are right back to importing goods from England. So this piece here, probably dating to about 1760. As I mentioned before, it is a sackback gown. So the lady would have these beautiful loose flowing pleats that fall from the shoulder. It seems as though we are missing the petticoat, pretty common. Sadly, it's a very large piece of fabric that can be used up for anything. Very frequently we find that gowns that survive from the 18th century are missing their petticoats. So really unusual. We'll talk about the Ormond dress over here in a little bit because it has its petticoat with it. Really, really rare. So we can see that there's this trim coming off the robings, really, really popular in the 18th century. And probably, if we could put this on a light table, we would see scar marks that go down the front edge here with even more trim that's probably now gone, probably updated or just taken off completely because it fell out of fashion at some point in the 1770s or 1780s as this garment continued to be used. Now, interestingly, just looking at this gown, this doesn't show a lot of alteration, but there is a little bit. If you look at the sleeves, when you guys get a chance, there's a couple places where it's been let out. So the sleeves have gotten bigger, perhaps with another wearer. But not a lot of evidence of change in her as much as the other ones here. So the next one sort of in generational history is the dress here in the box. And that one belonged to Tilly Dickinson. Is that right?
Bond.
Oh, Tilly Bond, I'm sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I'm using my cheat notes here. It was worn by Tilly Bond.
But it was worn by her many generations later.
Yes, exactly. and that is the reason why I wanted to talk about that one a little bit, because here again, we have multiple generations wearing the gown over and over again. It's very common to find gowns that were made in the 1760s, but then come back out and get reused and remade 100 years later, if not more. And so it's not only a testament of the quality of the fabric that was being produced in England and being purchased by individuals here, but also the sort of investment that individuals are making in textiles themselves. The textile is going to cost more than anything else that you're going to find. The making of it, what you're going to pay that Mantua Maker, is very little, not much at all. But the cost of the fabric is going to be the expense for an individual living 250 years ago. So that's what I sort of mean by an sort of investment. So this gown here is a center front closing gown. So as I mentioned, it is a little bit more updated. No longer has the robings coming off the shoulders. No longer has that stomacher. It just pins center front to close it. So for about 20 years, 1770 to about 25 years, 1770s through about 1800 or so, this is the typical way that gowns are going to be fastened and closed on the front. Now, interestingly enough, the note that's attached to this is that it claims that this fabric was potentially made in China, shipped to England, then it's making its way here, which very well could be. The gown is really, really fragile, but one of the telltale signs for Chinese fabrics that are being imported is the width of the fabric itself. So selvage to selvage, which is the loom width. Generally speaking, it's very narrow for the English. They really only have a capability of weaving fabric that's about 26 inches wide, 22 to 26 inches wide, whereas the Chinese are weaving much wider, can be up to 45 inches. And so we could tell that, it might be able to be one of the diagnostics we could take a look at to see if this was really Chinese fabric. Now, interestingly enough, with this fabric as well, it was woven with a silver stripe through it. Most of it is gone at this point, but there's a few areas, and it kind of looks like it's almost like it's stained, but it's like a silver pinstripe. It's now black. So when it was worn originally, it would have been bright white, just like you'd expect on your polished silver that you have at your house. Now, it's really hard to polish textile silver, though. Almost impossible. In fact, there's one, I've stumbled upon one receipt that discusses it. And it's kind of funny, the servants directory from the 1750s. And it suggests using burnt breadcrumbs as an abrasive to polish all of those silver and gold threads. Can't say we've ever tried that at Colonial Williamsburg on any of our gowns. I don't suggest you guys doing it either, but it is one way that they said worked. But if you're thinking about going to something that's very formal here in North Carolina, you're going to expect to wear light colors, metallics, because they pick up the candlelight a lot better, because we don't have a room that is lit, lit this bright in the 1770s. In this case, probably 1780s or 90s when this gown was actually made. This gown is also continues that tradition of open robes, so it does open in the front and would have to have a separate petticoat to fill that in. Now what's nice is you can kind of mix and match. So you might have a petticoat from another gown, or maybe a quilted petticoat, or maybe a Marcel petticoat, a machine quilted petticoat, and you can mix and match as you want with your gown, but you still have to have a petticoat to go with that one. Now the last two gowns here, last gown in the box was really, it was kind of a stumper when I began looking at it. And I'm still kind of scratching my head a little bit about it. Because the fabric of the gown dates to, by my own estimations, about the late 1770s, but it's in the fashion of about 1795 to 1800. So very curious there, and also curious too. I don't know if you guys can see, but it has these really long sleeves. My gloves. I don't know if you all can see the sleeve here. Really long, very, very slender arms, this Ormond. You can see that it's got this little cuff on it. So for the majority of the 18th century, most women had 3/4 length sleeves, generally ending right below the elbow. Just was the fashion, for almost 75 years. But by the time you get to the 1780s and into the 1790s, the sleeves begin to creep down the arm. And then by the mid-90s, we have long sleeved gowns becoming really, really, really popular. So kind of two things that could be happening here. One, was this an old gown that was then refashioned, brought up into style? So did Miss Ormond wear this in the late 1770s during sort of the wartime era, or maybe just after the war in the 1780s, and then have it updated about 1800 or 1795? The tricky bit here about that is the sleeves. Where are you going to get all that fabric from? And I'm not quite sure. This gown is a little bit different, still open robe, but has a very high waistline. So we're really starting to move into that Regency period, that neoclassical period, with the high waistline, sort of coming right underneath the bust. But it still kind of has the throwback to the earlier gowns because the petticoat, the one you see here, still survives. And so it is supposed to still open up the gown over top of the petticoat itself. Kind of weird, kind of interesting. We have a gown similar to this in Colonial Williamsburg's collection, but it's missing the petticoat. And so there is a lot of interesting transitional gowns that are being made in this period, and I think this gown is one of them. An interesting style, kind of playing with the new styles that are coming out. You can see very little, no trim on at all. And moving really away from these sort of, perhaps what they think is a much more stuffier sense here in the 1760s. But, as I said before, it was probably remade. So it's probably made from fabric that was a gown more akin to the gown you see here in the box below, and then sort of updated in its style with that really, really, really high waistline. All the garments you see here, they are all sewn by hand. There is no machine at this point in time to do any type of sewing at all. So every bit of this would have been completely done by hand. As much as they would have loved to have a machine, not the case. But, as I said, we do find evidence of machine work in some of these pieces that do get updated. So that's, again, one of these sort of points we begin to look for is, well, we know this gown was worn in 1908. Was it updated structurally at all in 1908? Did they use a machine to do it? Because that can also then help us to identify when those alterations may have taken place. So you might find machine work. Early machines are just chain stitches. So they're not the sort of bobbin and thread case that we typically find on a sewing machine. It's just a series of chain stitches on the top. And of course, the first sewing machine is invented in 1846. We can thank Elias Howe for that. So again, these kind of like points help us with our connoisseurship, our ability to look at these pieces and tell how they have changed over the years and who might be changing them. Is it a later generation? Did the garment get sold? Is it somebody within the family who's wearing it? Sometimes we get lucky, we get photographs of images and images of subsequent generations wearing them. So it's always interesting to kind of track that sort of through line of who is wearing these and when, and how are they changing them. Because unlike our wardrobes today in the 21st century, where we generally don't think about updating them in terms of cutting them apart and making them making something else out of them, that is always in game for these generations some 250 years ago. These things are thrown in trunks, they come back, they get cut apart, made into something else, because the textile, and if there's anything to walk away with from this talk, the textile is the most valuable thing. That is the big investment. It's not the time to actually make the actual garments themselves. Now, I've kind of yammered on for about 30 minutes now. What questions do you all have about the pieces up here, or about clothing in general throughout the 18th century? Happy to answer them, and we can take a closer look at some of these pieces. Yeah?
I have two questions.
Go for it.
What type of pins did they use?
Great question.
That was my question.
So your first question, pins. Pins come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. There are really fine pins. There are really coarse pins used in the period. They're generally steel. Sometimes the steel is tinned, so that way you're not getting rust marks on your clothing.
Is it like a straight?
Yeah, just a straight pin. Sorry. Yeah, just a straight pin. What's interesting too is when looking at these garments, you can find the evidence of pinning in the garment. Body gets hot, it gets sweaty, pins start to rust on your clothing or leave little rust stains, and so you see that on the garment itself. But yes, straight pins.
And who sewed women's clothing prior to 17?
Oh, well, great question. Yeah, really great question. So who sewed the clothing prior to that split? So what happens is the tailor's trade sewed for everybody. So they were making men's clothing and they were making women's clothing. But in the late 17th century, what happens is a new style of gown is developed. Now remember we called them the Mantua Makers, the gown makers? Well, guess what the name of that gown is called? A mantua. And so the mantua, or a coat, as it might be roughly translated, splits away because of this new style of loose flowing gown that was developed around the 1660s, around the Great Fire of London. Yeah, great question. Go ahead.
Are they two separate gowns up there?
They are not.
Okay.
This is one, so it's two separate pieces, but it's worn together.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
So this is the skirt, or the petticoat, goes on, in this case pretty high, because it's really high-waisted. And then this gown is then worn over top of it.
Okay.
Yep. But it's still opened up in the front to see the petticoat,
And
which is
then the
kind of weird.
bodice is what?
Yeah,
There's still
so
bodice on this side. Over here.
Yep, yep. So this is the bodice. See how narrow it is?
Right, but this. Yes.
What you're seeing is a vest.
Oh, okay.
There's a man's vest up here from
Oh,
probably.
okay.
You're all right here. It confused me too when I first saw it. I was like, oh, that's weird. A like an 1830s vest on. Never saw that before. No, so this is probably about 1830 or 1840.
Okay.
Man's vest.
Okay.
Yeah. A little bit of an optical illusion.
Tell us again the dates you said
Yeah.
and the fabric of the
So
style.
the fabric that the the way I would date it, and I have to
Yeah.
go back and get some resources if you really want to quote me on this.
Uh-huh.
Probably late 1770s, early 1780s,
Mhm.
based on the color choices, based on the types of weaves that we see here. But the style with this really high waist, late 1790s.
Uh-huh.
So it was probably a 1770s, 80s gown, and then remade.
Just to give a little information, Elizabeth Ormond Dickinson, she married Dr. Dickinson in 1777, so this could have been one of her.
Could have been her wedding gown. It very well could be her wedding gown. Maybe that's why it got saved.
Tell you that before.
She did not.
Well, I was gonna tell you that.
Go ahead.
Could she have bought the fabric in 1770, and then we started boycotting England,
Yeah.
so she didn't want to use it then, and waited until after the revolution.
Very well
to have
could
the
be.
dress made.
No, that's a great point. She may have been able to purchase something like this. Because I'll tell you this, I'm going to go on a limb here, but there is nowhere in North Carolina or Virginia in 1777, let's say, who could even make that. This is an industry of its own that's established in England. This is probably coming out of a small area in the east end of London called Spitalfields, being woven there and then being shipped over here. Now, that said, could it be French fabric? Could be. You know, by 1778, we have a treaty of alliance with the French. And we do find some more French goods being smuggled in, you know, being right here on the water. I mean, what's a better place to be to find those newly imported French goods? It take a little bit of effort because it's very oftentimes hard to identify whether this is French or English because they're just copying each other. But it's possible that we could be able to do it.
In Spitalfields, there were a lot of French Huguenots.
You're absolutely right. Yep, that's where they get started. They all come over and they begin spinning and weaving beautiful silks, and they really, really make a name for themselves there. So, but my guess is all three of these probably English, probably. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
The neckline around the darker colored
Yeah.
garment, is that known as ruching? Is that? Or
So they would just call it trim.
Okay.
So boring, I know. But they would just refer to it as trimmed. Yeah. Now what's interesting though, if you do take a closer look at it when you walk out, it is a technique on there called pinking. Now we all, I'm sure, have heard of pinking shears, you know, the scissors with a little jagged edge. This was probably done with a pinking iron. And so it's a chisel that's with this very deep triangle shape to it, and they're literally banging on it with a hammer to cut all those edges. Because that way you don't have to sit there and hem all of that. You know, they just pink it and it's left raw. So very, 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 very quick way to make trim and get that gown out the door.
And is there heat on that iron?
Nope, it's just it's a cutting edge. Yeah, so it's just. We've actually found archaeologically at Williamsburg some lead blocks with pinking edged iron, like the stamp into it. So they're obviously sticking it onto a lead block and just hammering into it. Yep. Yeah.
What about the cost of the fabric?
Yeah.
For relative to income of a, let's say, businessman?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, there's been a little bit of work on that. Unfortunately, it's not as easy of, oh, well, this gown would probably cost around 3 or 4 pounds. Well, what is that in today's money? Well, we really can't do that. Inflation, deflation, but we can kind of put it into the sense of how much somebody, like a tradesman, is working. And so Hal Gill in the 1980s did a lot of work on trying to figure out, because let me tell you, as an interpreter at Colonial Williamsburg, the number one question is, well, how much did you make back then? So he did a lot of work on researching in that, and it works out to be about 30 to 40 pounds a year somebody would earn as, let's say, a journeyman within their trade. Now, that's an average. Did some people make more? Absolutely. Did some people make less? Sure. Did some people have side hustles? Oh yeah. A lot of these folks are doing a lot of other different things than just their sole trade. So it can fluctuate a bit. But that said, you're probably looking at something like this being around 2 to 3 pounds. So a pretty expensive piece. Now this is silk though. How many silk gowns are in somebody's wardrobe? Probably depends on who you are. You know, there's lots of ways to obtain silk, like a fabric like this, than just going to the store and buying it. Christmas season's just over. Boxing Day, very popular day for giving gifts. particularly to individuals who are lower than your stature. So you might receive a Christmas box of fabric. Maybe it's silk. So there's a lot of different ways to get around having to buy brand new fabric and really lowering that cost. So for example, if we want to have this same gown made, it costs, let's say, £2. Randy, you're making 40 pounds a year. Let's have it made out of wool. Now you're talking that this is going to cost you around 2 shillings. So it's cut the price almost 200%. You know, so there's lots of different ways that you could work that. But I think the big thing to walk away with, one, as we said, textiles are expensive. They're imported. They are an investment. Two, there's lots of variety, so you're not always buying the most expensive thing. I mean, most of us aren't buying wedding gowns every day. And three, as an individual, you control the cost. So you're going to figure out what fits within your budget to have a gown made. You know, maybe it's not this fancy silk, but maybe it is. You know, maybe this was her wedding dress to begin with, and that's why it's, you know, survived onto that day. I'll give you a fourth one, which is a big one for Americans. There's credit. You can always buy the fabric on credit and pay it off over time, or through tobacco, which is probably what most folks in my area are doing. Probably a little bit of that going down here in the 1770s as well. Yeah.
So you said these were most probably made in England.
Well, the fabrics were, yes.
The fabrics.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
The gown itself, being that she's from Eatonton, probably made here in town.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
okay.
Yes, good question.
What kind of looms was it woven on?
So this is made on what they refer to as a draw loom. And so essentially the loom is set up and it can manipulate. So when you sit at a loom, the fibers that are going away from you is called the warp. And sorry if you know this, but just in case for those who don't. And then the fiber that you're filling with is called the weft. And so the draw loom is unique because each of those individual warp threads can be manipulated. And so you can raise an individual thread if you want to. That's how you get those flowers. And so as they're weaving it, they have a pattern in front of them. They lift up those threads. There's actually somebody on top of the loom who lifts up those areas to allow just for that one color to be passed through. So what happens is the English float these threads. I'm going to show you on the back side. You guys see that? And so they only fill in the areas that they need with the color. And so that way they're not wasting any of that extra silk, right? So this is another way to help identify that's more than likely an English made brocade. Very, very technical form of weaving. Go ahead.
So the fabric has passed through the loom one time and then it goes again through it, or is it?
So what happens, you're sitting there and you have a shuttle. The shuttle passes through, the draw loom comes up, but if you're only doing, like say if you're doing this area here, all of those individual colors you have individual shuttles for.
Okay.
And you pass those through just that area, and then they get snipped off.
Bitty bitty little
Yep,
shells?
yep, exactly. Now sometimes, if we don't have them on, well, let's take a look at this one over here. This may have it, but I bet it won't. Let's just see. Very careful. Oh, we do have some trim down the front here. You can barely see it, but you can see how they're floated there. But sometimes what happens, it's the same way as on the other one. But what happens sometimes on the really early ones, they float it all the way across. And so it uses up a lot of silk. And then, so like you'll have green, and then the little be just stringy threads behind that go all the way across the fabric on the back side. The problem is then people later wash it and it contracts. And so then you have people coming in with scissors. And we have this a lot on our antique gowns at Williamsburg, and just people just cut off the scissors to make it relax again, because they put it in a pot of boiling water or something. So that's why, I think one of the reasons why they stopped doing that is, one, people don't know how to do laundry, and two, it wastes a lot of fat, wastes a lot of fiber.
How would they have cleaned these?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so laundry in the 18th century is specifically referring to your undermost garments. So for the guys, it's their shirts, their stockings, neck stocks, For the ladies, it's their shifts, stockings. Sometimes you get ruffles on the end here that may be washed. But the one thing you'll find as a commonality here is that it is all white linen. It's nothing to do with color at all. So generally speaking, there's probably an individual or multiple individuals here in Edenton in the 18th century who were what they refer to as either dry scourers, dry cleaners, who will work on getting stains out. So they're not submerging this, but they're working to remove stain from a certain area. Or you might have an enslaved woman or man or a white servant who has specialized in that, and you might take it to them to remove those stains. But it's mostly going to end up being spot cleaning for these garments, rather than submerging, scrubbing, boiling. Because the other thing is, once you start doing that, you begin to lose the luster of the silk. It just doesn't look the same once it's been washed, particularly with some of the pretty hard, nasty soaps that they're using in the 18th century. Things like fuller's earth, you guys have probably heard that before, very commonly used to remove grease stains. It's a really dry, chalky earth, brushed on, soaked on there to pull out any grease they may get in areas. There are literally, it is a whole genre of books in the 18th century on dry cleaning. Whether you're good at it or not, I think that's the key thing. And there are definitely folks who specialize in it in the 18th century. Yeah.
How did they get perspiration on that?
Well, the undermost garment that you wear, the shirt and the shift, that is directly against your body.
That
So-
is true, but I'm not.
Oh yeah, let me tell you. And the thing is, what they end up doing, particularly when it's really hot, dog days of summer, they tend to wear more washable clothing. Like you're not gonna throw on your best silk in August. I guess you could if you wanted to. So they end up wearing plain linen gowns, all white gowns that are made of linen to be a lot more comfortable. Those types of things can get balled up, thrown in the laundry, and cleaned that way. But you can't do that to a silk gown.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah, well, odor is, through the centuries, viewed differently. I think we are in an era of being repulsed by it, but maybe not so much in the 18th. I mean, I didn't live back then, but we don't see a lot of people talking about it, so. And they'll be asking the same questions about us 200 years from now, but yet I think if they got a snapshot of Target in the deodorant aisle, they would probably make some inferences there. It's just hot. There's really not much you can do about it, sadly. But they did change their clothing. They absolutely did. Several individuals write in the 18th and 19th century about both men and women, saying how basically all they wear below the Mason-Dixon line is white. They wear no color at all. There's a great quote from a man by the name of John Harrower. He was from Scotland. He was actually from the Isle of Skye, so like way, way, way up north. And he comes to Fredericksburg, Virginia as a school teacher, but he's an indentured servant. And he writes his wife back and he says, my dear, I think you'll scarce know me now. There are no blue, brown, black, or gray at all here in Virginia. The only color about me is my hair and my shoes. So the wig that he wears and then his black shoes that he's wearing. Everything else is just white and very thin. So he actually remarks too when he stops wearing his summer clothing, which was 2 days, it was November 27th. So interesting how late he's wearing his thin summer clothes and the short amount of time that he's wearing his winter wool coat.
Is that a little child's doll at the bottom of that?
It is. I don't know much about
Box?
it. Yeah, it looks to me like it's probably 19th century. Little wooden arms to her. Yeah, maybe late or maybe early 18th century. Early 19th century. Most of the dolls from this period are wood, carved, painted, and then dressed. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you think the color of this gown is what it was at that time, or has that faded?
It's faded a little bit. Yeah. She probably was a little bit more bronzy. You kind of see on the back side here when you get to come up when you're on your way out. She's a little bit more bronzy, though. Really popular in the 1760s. Really, really popular color.
Is the men's vest silk?
Yes.
This one? Yes, sir. Yep. So really popular as well. Probably a wedding vest, my guess. These white on white brocaded vests or white on white damask vests were really popular for weddings. You see them being sold as such, wedding vests. Yeah. It's hard to believe, guys don't wear a lot of silk today. Maybe a tie.
Would you see much variation between, let's say, Edenton fashion and New York or Philadelphia?
Yeah, sure, and people comment on that too. On different fashions. Generally in the Tidewater here, we're really boring. I mean, I hate to break it to us all, but everybody who travels through this area in the 18th century, it's neat and plain. Good quality fabrics, excellent examples here, but no trim, nothing over the top. No gold or silver laces for the guys. It's just good, really high quality plain silks, and that's it. Neatly cut, nicely draped onto the body, but nothing like way over the top. There's no gold or silver flowers on here. Go down to Charleston, totally different area. They very much comment on Charlestonians love to wear their money on their clothes. Gold, silver embroidery, way over the top. Same goes for if you go up towards Philadelphia, the Quakers in the city there. Again, very, very plain clothing, but extremely high quality. So they're really investing in the quality, but it's drab silk, it's drab wool. So yeah, definitely, you